Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take on those complex, sometimes really charged topics, and we try to hand you the blueprint, the framework, to understand them from the ground up.
And today, we are absolutely tackling one of the big ones. We're looking at law enforcement.
Specifically that constant tension between the police and the public they're supposed to protect.
Right. And, this relationship, it isn't some abstract academic thing. It is completely fundamental to social stability.
I mean, it's everything.
It is. And when you look at the material we're working from today, the historical sources, the modern research, one thing just leaps off the page.
And what's that?
That for any police force to be efficient, especially now, technology has made the world so small, you absolutely must have positive, long-term cooperation with the community.
That cooperation, it's not a nice to have.
No, it's mandatory. It has to be. Because police forces, they're rightly held accountable for everything they do.
And accountability, that just doesn't work without trust. You need that community buy-in.
Exactly. So our mission today is, well, it's pretty complex. We're going to be diving into the absolute core theories of policing. We're looking at global models, what worked and what really failed spectacularly.
And then we're going to bring it all home and focus really sharply on how these big ideas translate or, how they clash with the system in India, which is massive and highly centralized.
And that's the conflict, isn't it? That tension between the goal of control versus the goal of service. It just forces us to go all the way back, right back to the origins of modern policing.
Almost 200 years ago.
We can't understand the challenges you see today without getting a grip on the foundational philosophy that was laid down way back then. So, okay, let's unpack this core theory.
Our journey starts in London. The year is 1829, and the figure at the center of it is Sir Robert Peel. His ideas were, and I think still are, pretty revolutionary. He was the one who introduced the Metropolitan Police Act.
Yeah, and this is so key. He wasn't just, creating another group of guys in uniforms. He was trying to establish a completely new social contract.
A contract with the people. So what was the absolute heart of that philosophy?
Well, Peel, he was the UK Home Secretary at the time, later became Prime Minister, and he laid down what we now see as the foundational rule of policing by consent. It's this one phrase.
What is?
Police are public and public are police.
It sounds so simple, almost like a catchy slogan.
It does, but the implications were just. They were massive. Before Peel, you have to remember, policing was often just an external force. It was coercive. It was employed by the state to keep people in line.
So Peel comes in and says, no, security is a collective responsibility.
Yes. He just completely redefined it. He stripped away the whole idea that keeping society safe was only the job of, specialized armed agents of the government.
So in his model, crime prevention starts with every single person.
Exactly. It fundamentally means that every individual has to be active, vigilant. They are the first line of defense, the constant surveillance mechanism, if you will.
That's a radical idea. I mean, it ties the very legitimacy of the police directly to public cooperation, to public approval.
Not to military strength, not to state coercion. It's all about consent.
So it's this profound decentralization of responsibility. You're spreading the burden of maintaining order across the whole population. But if that's the case, if everyone is the police, why did he still create a specialized, paid body of official police officers?
And that is the crucial distinction he made, and it's one that often gets lost today. The system demanded what he called co-production, but the roles were very distinct.
Okay, break that down for us.
So the general public, their job was the broad general policing duties. That's the constant vigilance we talked about, preventing crime just by being present and, reporting anything suspicious.
And the official police?
The official police were created as a specialized, very narrow group. Their job was supposed to be highly technical.
Technical in what way?
Detailed criminal investigation, sophisticated information gathering, basically handling the mechanics of the law after a failure of prevention had already happened.
So the uniformed officer, the Bobby on the beat, they weren't there to replace public vigilance. They were there to augment it with skills the average person just doesn't have.
Precisely. Like forensics or complex interrogations. The whole principle was that for social order to work, the police and the public have to operate and coordinate at the same time.
It's a partnership.
It is. If the public failed in its vigilance, the official police would step in with their technical skills. But, and this is the most important part, the official police could only succeed if they had the public's ongoing trust and cooperation.
Because if the public stops talking to them, stops giving them information.
The whole system fails. The specialized force is blind.
And Peel's ideas, they were specifically tied to the society and the geography of London at the time. That's why it's called the Metropolitan Policing System.
Yes, exactly. The whole philosophy, that emphasis on service, the less intimidating uniforms, the fact they were unarmed, it was all designed for the Metropolitan Policing System, or MPS.
It was a system for domestic order in a democracy.
It was all about securing the consent of the people being governed. And that MPS model, the one that emphasizes service over command, that is what you have to consider the global blueprint for any successful community policing.
That historical context is so critical because as you look around the world, not every nation, especially those with, a colonial history, they didn't adopt Peel's philosophy.
Not at all.
And the sources we're looking at, they present two fundamentally opposed models and the choice a country makes that dictates everything about its relationship with its community. This is where it gets really interesting, the split between the idea of service and the idea of control.
The split is it's stark. And it really sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about. So Peel gave us what we can call Model A, the Metropolitan Policing System, the MPS.
Okay, Model A.
And its core principle, as we've said, is rooted in service to the people. The goal, the desired outcome, is to build genuine public trust and to actively reduce public fear of the police.
And what's its operational objective? How does it actually function?
It focuses on preventing crime through visibility, through community engagement. And then, when prevention fails, it conducts those detailed technical investigations.
And there's a key term the sources use to define its whole ethos.
Right. It's about upholding the law. And that word choice is deliberate. Upholding means ensuring justice and due process and fairness are the top priority, even while you're enforcing the law.
So the police are seen as impartial facilitators, arbiters of social order.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the counter model.
Yeah.
Model B, the one that was developed not for domestic order, but for external control, typically in colonial settings.
The opposite of the MPS.
The total opposite. This is Model B, the Irish Constabulary Policing System, or ICPS.
And this system didn't originate to serve the people of London.
No. It originated to maintain control over a resistant population in Ireland. And its core principle is completely different. It operates on fear psychosis.
Fear psychosis. That's a powerful term. What does that actually look like on the street?
It means the entire approach is designed to assert dominance, to create psychological distance. The officers might be more heavily armed, their demeanor's more aggressive. Patrols are geared towards signaling overwhelming state authority, not having a conversation.
So the natural outcome is pretty obvious.
Inevitable. A crippling trust deficit between the constabulary and the public. It's baked into the system.
Okay, so if the MPS objective is prevention and investigation,
Yeah.
what is the ICPS primarily focused on?
Its objective is not prevention in that community spirit of Peel.
Yeah.
It is fundamentally about subjugating people to maintain political control.
So it's the difference between problem solving and just power assertion.
That's a perfect way to put it. The ICPS is mostly concerned with asserting the state's authority and ensuring obedience. Its core goal is defined as maintaining law and order.
And that's another key word, maintaining.
Yes, and it often means maintaining order, irrespective of justice or fairness, as long as political stability is secured for the ruling power.
So that is the critical distinction. If the MPS seeks to uphold the law with fairness and service, the ICPS seeks to maintain order with command and control.
Precisely. And the sources we're looking at are completely unequivocal on this point. The ICPS is structurally unsuitable for successful community policing.
Why?
Because it's designed to maintain distance. It's designed to generate distrust. It just doesn't have the internal mechanisms or, frankly, the external mandate to build the complex long-term relationships that real community policing demands.
This distinction, service versus control, it really sets the entire framework for the challenges we're going to see later in India, doesn't it?
It does. And it highlights why trying to launch a community policing initiative in a country that has an ICPS legacy.
It's like trying to install a cooperative-friendly operating system onto hardware that was designed for one thing and one thing only: command.
That's an excellent analogy. The philosophy is the software, but the structure is the hardware. So we've established that the Metropolitan Service Model, that's the necessary philosophical software. But what global history shows us, again and again, is that just changing the policy, just changing the rhetoric, it's not enough.
Right, because you have these deep structural and cultural barriers that can just completely derail any new initiative.
Everywhere.
So if we connect this back to the bigger picture, what are the mandatory, the non-negotiable structural conditions that have to be in place for community policing to even have a chance of succeeding?
The sources point to two essential needs. First, police organizations need a high degree of operational autonomy,
Meaning what, exactly?
meaning frontline officers and their local commanders have to have the freedom to respond quickly, creatively,
Well,
to local needs, without having every single decision filtered up through layers and layers of bureaucracy.
and the second condition.
The entire organization's core philosophy has to embody a motto of service to the people, and it has to be aimed explicitly at building confidence.
So service can't just be a slogan on a poster.
No, it has to be the metric for success, the thing that gets measured and rewarded, not just arrest rates or, other statistics.
And it seems like the level of centralization in a police force is the single biggest operational barrier you can have. The structure of the organization, it's either a launchpad or a coffin for community engagement.
Absolutely. And we see this play out perfectly in the case studies of Israel and Japan. It's what the sources call the decentralization factor.
Okay, let's start with Israel.
So the Israel police, they were trying to modernize, and they adopted the MPS model conceptually. They had the right philosophy, the right software, but they failed, at least initially.
Why, if they had the right idea?
Because their internal structure, their hardware, it remained highly centralized.
So why does centralization specifically kill community policing? What's actually happening on the ground?
Well, centralization means that your local police units, they can't adapt. They can't respond to the unique needs of their specific community. Whether that's an immigrant community or a dense urban area or a sprawling rural one.
It's a one-size-fits-all approach.
A rigid one-size-fits-all approach. Decisions are slow. Information gets totally distorted traveling up and down that long chain of command. And worst of all, there's just no mandate for local commanders to build those custom, trusting relationships. It's the exact antithesis of community policing.
Okay, so now contrast that with Japan, where they had significant success.
The Japanese police succeeded by adopting what's known as Theory Z operations, and that involves significant decentralization.
Theory Z, what is that?
It's a management philosophy, really. It emphasizes things like long-term employment, making decisions by consensus, and collective responsibility. And in the policing context, this translated into their famous Kobans.
The little neighborhood police boxes.
That's right. And this Theory Z approach, it creates highly motivated, locally focused officers who have long career paths in one area. They develop this deep, intimate knowledge of their neighborhood. They know the residents. They know the problems.
And they have the autonomy to actually solve those problems locally.
Yes. That shift in structure, that shift in organizational behavior, all driven by decentralization, it allows them to build trust proactively. And that trust is the absolute prerequisite for success.
So, okay, even if you get the structure right, you can still face this huge problem of culture. The sources point out that internal cynicism, it can be like a deadly disease for reform efforts. And they use the Netherlands as an example.
This is maybe the most difficult lesson for anyone trying to reform a big institution. So in the Netherlands, they tried to bring in community policing. But participation was limited. It was just a few enthusiastic officers and commanders.
And the rest of the force?
The majority, the status quoists, they resisted.
Hmm.
They saw community engagement not as real policing, but as social work. And they just cynically marginalized the reformers.
How did they do that? I mean, what kind of language did they use to undermine them?
They labeled the officers who were doing the community work, they called them beat nurses or social psychologists.
Wow.
Yeah. And those labels, they're designed to do one thing: undermine the professional status of the officers involved. It suggests they aren't real police doing real law enforcement work.
And that internal culture war creates a massive operational rift.
It does. And that cynicism, it just proves that any reform has to be broad-based. Can't be a niche department or one special team. It has to be an organization-wide commitment.
Otherwise, the existing culture, whether it's fear-based or command-based, it will just reject and isolate the reformers.
Absolutely. The status quo has deep roots and is protected by the majority who, they fear change or they fear more administrative work. You cannot overcome decades of institutional inertia with just a handful of optimists.
And that leads us directly to the grassroots level, the officers on the street doing the actual day-to-day work. What happens when this idea of community engagement threatens their own personal professional security? And this is where the case study from Uganda comes in.
Right. So Uganda launched a community police liaison officer program. On paper, It looked ideal, but it failed catastrophically
And why?
because the grassroots personnel felt profoundly insecure. And this insecurity was rooted in something the sources call the status fear.
Explain that. The stratosphere, what were they actually afraid of losing?
They were afraid that increased public awareness, which is the entire goal of community policing, would expose the existing power dynamics.
Dynamics that are often based on, what, opaque practices,
Yeah.
petty corruption.
Exactly. And they feared it would lower their actual status in the community and potentially even reduce their earnings, both the legitimate and the illegitimate ones. Their perceived power came from the fact that the public did not know the details of policing.
So, if the public becomes informed, if they become capable of demanding accountability, the officer feels like their established authority is being threatened.
It's the direct inverse of what Peel wanted. And it just proves that for this to succeed, you need more than just training. You need motivated and educated grassroots staff who are professionally secure.
They have to see community engagement not as a threat, but as an enhancement of their status.
Yes, as an enhancement of their status as educated, trusted public servants. If your frontline personnel are poorly educated, if they're unmotivated, and they feel their position is precarious, they will actively undermine any effort that invites public scrutiny. The cultural success of community policing starts right there, with the individual officer's security and competence.
Okay, so now we have the global framework. We have Peel's ideal, the disastrous ICPS legacy, the failures of centralization in Israel, the cultural cynicism in the Netherlands, and that crippling status fear in Uganda. So now we turn to the specific structure that you, our listener, are interested in. What does all this accumulated global knowledge mean for India, a nation that directly inherited a colonial police structure?
The analysis immediately confirms what you'd expect. The Indian policing system is modeled directly on the Irish Constabulary policing system, the ICPS.
So its organizational DNA is rooted in control.
It is, rooted in control and maintaining order, prioritizing security assertions over complex crime prevention and dedicated public service. It's a systemic legacy, not just a matter of current policy.
The system was literally built for a colonial authority.
Precisely. Its core function was to enforce the will of the state, regardless of local consent. Now, it's important to add some nuance here. The system isn't static. We're seeing a gradual, slow, but very real shift towards the service principle.
What's driving that shift?
It's often catalyzed by forceful directives from the Supreme Court and also by public demand. But those forces, they are fighting against deeply entrenched structural and organizational hurdles that were inherited from the ICPS.
Let's talk about those structural hurdles. Starting with the hierarchy. We saw how centralization cripples responsiveness in Israel. How pronounced is that structure in India?
It is intensely pronounced, and it's a central point of failure. The structure is highly centralized, which ensures that power stays concentrated at the highest levels, far away from the community. And critically, the system contains at least 12 distinct levels of hierarchy.
12 levels. Can you explain why that specific detail is so debilitating for community policing?
It's debilitating for, I'd say, three main reasons. First, information distortion.
Okay.
Any input from the public or from a frontline officer, it has to travel through 12 filters. That ensures that the original nuanced community message is drastically simplified or even lost completely before it ever reaches a decision maker.
And the second reason?
Slow decision making. Local officers just don't have the autonomy to respond immediately to local crises. It's the opposite of the decentralization success we saw in Japan.
And the third, and you said perhaps the most damaging,
It reinforces the narrow-based approach.
that siloing we talked about in the Netherlands.
Exactly. When you have an organization with 12 levels, you enforce strict silos. And the effectiveness of community policing, as we saw, demands broad organization-wide involvement, from the lowest constable right up to the Director General of Police.
And a centralized, siloed structure pretty much guarantees that any new community initiatives will be seen as niche projects.
As extra duties, not as core mandates. And that leads directly to that cultural cynicism we observed. The structure just screams out for what they call delayering.
And finally, that brings us back to the fundamental barrier we saw in Uganda, the competence gap at the grassroots level.
This is the critical frontline issue. The lower-level officials, the constables who are the public's primary point of contact, they are often generally ill-trained and less educated compared to their commissioned superiors.
And that creates the perfect storm for the status fear phenomenon.
It does. Lack of education leads to insecurity, which leads to resistance against public scrutiny. I mean, if the person who shows up at your door lacks a professional education to handle a complex civil dispute fairly, the entire system loses credibility right there.
So to address this specific systemic weakness, the sources bring up the recommendations of the Soli Sorabji Committee. Who was Sorabji, and what was the radical change his committee proposed to fix this grassroots problem?
Soli Sorabji was a very distinguished former Attorney General of India. His committee, which was focused on police reform, it addressed this competence and status issue head-on. Their recommendation was transformative.
And what was it?
They proposed recruiting the lowest-level officials as grade 2 officers, and, critically, instituting a mandatory minimum qualification requirement of graduation, a university degree.
A degree. Why mandate a degree for an entry-level constable?
The goal was twofold. First, to actually increase the competence, the critical thinking, the communication skills of the frontline staff, to make them better problem solvers, which is what community policing requires.
And the second goal.
And this is crucial, to elevate their professional status and their self-esteem. By raising the entry requirement, you signal that this is a vital job that requires an educated professional, and that directly combats the insecurity that fuels the status fear.
So you make them more motivated to engage positively with the public instead of fearing accountability.
That's the idea. It's an attempt to break that ICPS legacy right at the point of public contact.
So despite these, overwhelming structural headwinds, the ICPS legacy, the intense centralization, the grassroots competence gap, we have to acknowledge that various states have recognized these failures and have pioneered some really remarkable localized community policing efforts.
We do. And these initiatives, they really represent attempts to build that Peel-inspired service model, often by working around the rigid constraints of the centralized structure.
These local innovations are fascinating. They show that knowledge is being applied out of sheer necessity. Let's look at 3 distinct types, starting with one of the older examples. The Neighborhood Watch scheme in Delhi. That was launched back in 1989. What were its practical objectives?
The objectives were the standard community policing goals.
Yeah.
Reduce crime, improve police public relations, rebuild trust. But the mechanism they used in Delhi was particularly insightful. It focused on creating these localized, self-help mini-neighborhood groups.
Okay.
But the unique recruitment method was the key. These groups were often explicitly centered on burglary victims.
That seems like a really smart way to generate immediate, high-level motivation. You're targeting people who have already suffered a breakdown in security.
Exactly. It's targeted prevention, and it's driven by a shared vulnerability. By focusing on victims, the police could provide very specific, highly relevant preventive advice. Like, hardening targets, installing better locks or alarms, improving street lighting. This approach mobilized the community around a tangible shared security need. It transformed tragedy into vigilance, and it ensured the groups were proactive, not just reactive.
The community was trained to become the primary custodian of its own security.
Yes, allowing the official police to then focus their limited resources somewhere else.
Okay, now let's move into the 21st century. The Mumbai police initiated a really fascinating project in 2004 that dealt with the realities of modern urban density, the slum police panchayats.
This was absolutely critical. Slums constitute an astonishing 60% of Mumbai's population.
60%.
60%. A.N. Roy, who was the commissioner of Mumbai Police at the time, he recognized that traditional police stations just could not manage the sheer volume of local conflicts and disputes that are generated in such dense environments.
So the objective was to handle these disputes before they blew up into serious criminal matters.
Before they required formal police intervention, yes.
So how did these panchayats, these committees, actually function on the ground to achieve that early intervention?
They're essentially based on alternative dispute resolution, ADR.
For our listeners, what is ADR?
It's a range of processes, things like mediation or arbitration, that are used to resolve disputes without having to go to a formal court. So these panchayats, they functioned as local mediation centers. Their role was twofold.
Okay.
First, to resolve local civil disputes, noise complaints, property arguments, domestic disagreements, settle them early and informally. And second, they became critical assistants to the police in monitoring crime and collecting reliable local information.
They became the eyes and ears of the force.
Within those dense areas, yes, they were a true co-production model, relying on the community's intimate local knowledge to provide the early warning system that a police force sitting in its centralized stations could never have.
And it relied on collaboration too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Their success was tied to it. They deliberately ran the program in association with experienced NGOs, notably the National Slum Dweller Federation and Mahila Milan,
Why was that NGO partnership so vital?
because it provided local legitimacy. It ensured the panchayats were seen as being owned by the community, not just another coercive police outreach arm. The NGOs provided the deep community roots you need for effective mediation.
Okay, finally, let's look at the older, more legally institutionalized approach. The village defense systems. These rely on formal acts and historical context, especially in rural areas. Let's start with Karnataka.
The Karnataka model, the Village Defense Party, it really shows how community engagement can be anchored in law. It was established by the Karnataka Village Defense Parties Act back in 1964.
And having that legal basis, that provides clarity and authority.
And accountability for their existence, yes.
So how is that system structured and how is it controlled? Because giving civilians policing power, that requires some tight regulation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the system is headed locally by the village dalapatis. They're essentially the local community leaders who are empowered to lead the defense party. But critically, these parties are constituted by the superintendent of police, the SUP, the top district police official.
So that ensures they remain under police authority and direction.
Yes.
And what about the size of these parties? Did the law put constraints on them to stop them from becoming some kind of unruly paramilitary force?
It did. That control mechanism is key. The law mandates that the strength of the party is capped at 10% of the village population or 48 members, whichever is lower.
So that numerical constraint, that's a direct measure to ensure they're manageable.
And to prevent them from evolving beyond a localized defense and vigilance function. Their duties are basic but crucial for rural order: patrolling, protecting person and property, and maintaining basic order.
Okay, now contrast that with the motivation for the village defense societies in Madhya Pradesh.
The MP societies started a bit earlier in the 1960s, and they were a more reactive community mobilization effort. They were driven by a very specific, very violent security threat.
Which was?
They were primarily a response to the pervasive and destructive dacoity problem in the agrarian regions at the time.
For listeners who might not be familiar, what exactly does the dacoity problem entail in that context?
Dacoity refers to organized, often heavily armed, banditry. These dacoit gangs would systematically raid, terrorize, and exploit agrarian communities. This created an immediate existential threat that required a concerted collective local defense response.
So these societies were organized out of pure necessity.
To protect life and property when the formal, centralized police response was often too slow or just too geographically distant to be effective. And, these historical examples, they prove that necessity really is the mother of community policing invention. But they operate as islands of effectiveness within a vast, centralized sea.
This has been an incredibly detailed deep dive. We trace the concept of legitimate policing all the way back to Sir Robert Peel's foundational ideal of co-production. We drew that sharp line between the trust-building MPS model and the fear-based, control-oriented ICPS model.
And then we identified those universal structural barriers to successful reform centralization, that cultural cynicism we saw in the Netherlands, and the critical need for motivated grassroots personnel.
And applying that entire framework to India, it just reveals the immense challenge.
It does. The Indian policing system has to overcome the deep-seated ICPS legacy of hierarchy and fear psychosis. And true success? As all those global case studies highlight, it requires two major non-negotiable shifts.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have to address the cultural cynicism of the wider force to make sure that community service is rewarded, not ridiculed. And second, you have to secure the motivation and the education of the grassroots personnel.
Which is precisely the goal of the Soli Sorabji Committee's recommendation for graduated Grade 2 officers.
Exactly.
And the localized initiatives in Delhi, Mumbai, and Karnataka, they show impressive ingenuity, but they can't replace large-scale systemic structural reform. They're localized patches on a vast hierarchical canvas.
They are.
So this whole journey, it raises an absolutely crucial question that we have to leave you with.
If centralization and hierarchy and a lack of grassroots motivation are the primary proven roadblocks to effective community policing globally, as we saw in the failures in Israel and Uganda, how might the sheer size, the immense regional and linguistic diversity, and the wildly varying levels of administrative capacity across India not just impede, but actively exacerbate these failures?
We've seen localized success stories, but what systemic steps are necessary to transition from these successful local efforts to an organization-wide sustainable change that can actually survive shifting political mandate?
It really leaves you wondering whether fundamental cultural change, which has to start at the lowest rank, can ever truly be mandated successfully from the top of the 12-level hierarchy.
A question that demands continued vigilance and I think a lot more creative solutions. We encourage you to keep diving deep into these ideas.